The rain had been falling since late evening, and by the time midnight came, the roads were almost empty. Street lamps glowed weakly through the fog, and water streaked down their metal poles like tears. A single bus rumbled along the highway, its wipers struggling against the storm. Inside, the heater gave off a dull hum, and the driver, an older man with heavy eyes, kept glancing at the mirrors as if expecting someone to appear in the seats behind him. It was the night route, a service most people avoided unless they had no other choice. The route cut through the countryside, winding past abandoned petrol stations and forgotten villages where the windows were always dark. The passengers who boarded at the city stops were few, and they rarely looked at one another. They sat silent, watching the rain blur across the windows. On this night, there were 6 passengers. A young woman with a backpack pressed against her chest, 2 men in cheap suits who looked like they had drunk more than they could handle, a mother with a child who had already fallen asleep, and finally, a man who had boarded at the very last city stop. He wore a long, dark coat, his hat pulled low over his face. He had slipped a few coins into the machine, taken his ticket without a word, and walked to the back seat. No one saw him clearly, but they felt the sudden drop in the air when he entered, as if a draft had followed him inside. The driver noticed too. He kept adjusting his mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of the man's face. But every time the light shifted, the shadow of the hat concealed it. The driver told himself it was nothing. People rode his bus all the time who didn't want to be seen. Still, something about that figure made the hair at the back of his neck prickle. The bus rolled deeper into the countryside. The glow of the city vanished behind them, and the road grew darker. Trees pressed close to the windows, their branches scraping against the glass whenever the wind rose. The 2 drunk men were muttering to each other, their laughter slurred and heavy. The young woman stared at her phone, but the signal had already dropped to nothing, leaving her scrolling through an empty screen. The mother held her child tighter as the bus swayed, her eyes darting to the back where the last passenger sat motionless. At the first countryside stop, no one was waiting. The driver slowed anyway, opened the doors, and let the cold night air rush in. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing beyond the fog, but when he blinked, the space was empty. He closed the doors quickly and pulled away, his hands tight on the wheel. The rain grew heavier. The road was slick and narrow, lined with trees that bent under the weight of the storm. The driver concentrated, leaning forward, but in the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange. The last passenger had not moved since boarding. He was still sitting at the very back, his hat low, his coat draped across his knees. But when the bus passed under a broken lamppost, for just a second,
The driver thought the seat beside the man was occupied. Someone was there, blurred, like smoke trapped in the shape of a body. The driver shook his head. It was late, he told himself. He was tired, maybe seeing things. But when he glanced again, the seat was empty. Another stop approached. This one was a small shelter with a single bench. As the bus slowed, the driver saw a figure standing there, waving frantically. A young man in a hoodie, his face pale under the street lamp. Relieved to have a normal passenger, the driver opened the doors. The young man rushed inside, dripping wet, his shoes squeaking against the floor. "Thanks," he said between breaths. "Didn't think anyone was running tonight."
The driver nodded and pulled away. The new passenger found a seat near the middle of the bus. He glanced around, nodded politely to the mother, and then looked toward the back. His expression changed. His eyes narrowed. Then he quickly turned forward again, his shoulders tense. The driver noticed. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice low. The young man shook his head quickly. "No, nothing. Just thought I saw someone I knew." But he didn't look back again. The bus pressed on, deeper into the countryside. The storm battered the windows, and the sound of rain on the roof was like 1,000 hands drumming in unison. One by one, the passengers grew restless. The child stirred in her sleep. The young woman shifted uncomfortably, clutching her backpack tighter. The two drunk men had stopped laughing. They sat still, staring at the back of the bus with glassy eyes, as if something held their attention. At the third stop, again, no one was waiting. But when the driver opened the doors, the wind howled inside, colder than before. The lights flickered once, twice, before steadying. The driver's eyes darted to the mirror. The last passenger had moved. His head was tilted, as though he was looking directly at the driver through the reflection. The driver gripped the wheel so hard, his knuckles whitened. He told himself not to look again, just keep driving. But curiosity gnawed at him until he risked another glance. The man was still staring, and this time the driver realized the hat was gone. The face was pale, far too pale, as if it had been drained of blood. The eyes were black, not just dark, but empty, holes where light should be. And though the man's lips were pressed together, the driver heard something, a whisper, curling through the bus like smoke. No one else seemed to react. The mother held her child. The young woman looked at her useless phone. The drunk men sat frozen. Only the young man in the hoodie seemed aware, his hands gripping the seat in front of him, his head bowed as though he dared not look back. The bus lurched forward into the night, its engine groaning. The driver tried to steady his breathing, but the whisper grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out the storm. Words he could not understand, words that felt older than the road itself. He risked one final glance. The last passenger was smiling. The storm raged harder. drowning the bus in a roar of water and wind. The driver's hands trembled on the wheel, but he did not dare stop. Something told him that if he pulled over, if he let the engine die, whatever rode with them in the back would come forward. The whisper filled his skull, pressing against his thoughts, wrapping around him like cold fingers. The young woman finally looked up from her phone, frustrated. "No signal out here at all," she muttered, more to herself than anyone. But as she shifted in her seat, she froze. Her gaze slipped past the rows of empty chairs until it reached the very back. Her face drained of color. She blinked again, then quickly turned her head away, clutching her backpack as if it could shield her. The two drunk men were no longer laughing, no longer muttering. They sat stiff, eyes locked on the dark figure. One of them whispered to the other, "Don't look at him, just don't look," and his voice cracked like glass. The mother stirred, sensing the unease. She brushed hair from her child's damp forehead, glancing over her shoulder. She gasped softly, covering her mouth, and then pressed the sleeping girl tighter to her chest. Her lips moved in a silent prayer. The only one who said nothing was the young man in the hoodie. He sat rigid, staring at the floor, sweat dripping from his temples, though the air inside the bus was ice cold. The driver's chest tightened. He needed to know. He needed to break the silence before he lost his mind. His voice cracked as he asked, You see him too, don't you?" No one answered. The whisper thickened, crawling into the spaces between every sound, until even the rain seemed muted. The lights above flickered again, and for an instant, the entire bus went dark. When the bulbs snapped back, the last passenger was no longer at the back. He was 5 rows closer, sitting perfectly still, pale face angled toward the driver. The bus swayed dangerously as the driver nearly lost control. "No," he muttered, gripping the wheel. "No, no, no." The young woman whimpered, pressing herself into the window. The drunk men lowered their heads, shielding their faces, as if from a blinding light. The mother's hands shook as she held her child, whispering, "Go back to sleep, baby, go back to sleep." And the young man in the hoodie finally lifted his head. His eyes were red, wet with tears. "He's choosing," he said softly. "Every time this bus runs, he chooses someone." The driver looked at him through the mirror. "What are you talking about?" The young man swallowed hard, his voice shaping. "I've seen him before, months ago. Same route, same storm. He rides until he decides. Then they never get off the bus." The words fell heavy, heavier than the storm. The driver's stomach churned. He wanted to stop, to throw open the doors and run, but his body would not obey. The whisper had become a command, urging him to keep driving. The bus passed another stop. Again, no one waited. Again, the doors opened on their own, the wind screaming inside,
the smell of earth and rot filling the cabin. When the doors closed, the lights flickered, and the last passenger had moved again. Now he sat only 2 rows from the mother and child. Her eyes widened in terror. She held her daughter so tightly the girl stirred, whimpering in her sleep. The mother's lips trembled as she begged, "Please, not her. Please take me instead." The figure did not respond. Its black eyes locked onto the little girl, its pale smile stretching wider. The whisper became a low growl, pressing against every skull, shaking loose memories and fears. The driver shouted, "Leave them alone!" His voice cracked, his throat raw, but the figure did not move. The young man stood suddenly, his hands shaking. "It has to be me," he said, louder this time. "It followed me. It's been waiting." Everyone stared at him. His face was pale, hollow, as if he had carried this weight for too long. "The last time, my sister was on this bus. She was chosen. I got off, left her behind. She never came home." His voice broke. "It should have been me. It should have been me." He took a step down the aisle. The lights dimmed, the bus groaned, and the last passenger turned its head toward him. The smile widened further, impossible, splitting across its face like a crack in stone. "No!" the driver yelled. "Don't!" But it was too late. The young man reached the seat where the figure sat. For the first time, the dark coat shifted, the body beneath rising slightly. Cold rushed forward, thick enough to make the windows frost. The young man gasped as the figure placed one pale hand on his chest. His breath left him in a white cloud, his body trembling violently. The bus jolted as if it had struck something. The passengers screamed. The lights flickered wildly, and when they steadied, the seat was empty. The last passenger was gone. And so was the young man. Only his hoodie remained, crumpled on the seat, soaked as though it had been left in the rain. Silence spread through the bus, broken only by the storm. The mother wept softly into her daughter's hair. The young woman pressed her face against the window, refusing to look. The 2 drunk men clutched each other like children. The driver stared at the road, his vision blurred. His hands shook on the wheel, but the whisper was gone. Only the echo of it remained, faint as a memory. They reached the final stop just before dawn. The bus hissed to a halt, doors opening to the cold morning air. One by one, the passengers stumbled out, pale and silent, their eyes refusing to meet the drivers. The mother carried her child, who still slept, her face hidden in her shoulder. The drunk men vanished into the fog. The young woman hurried away, never once turning back. The driver sat alone, staring into the mirror. The back seats were empty. He told himself it was over. He told himself he could drive again tomorrow, that it had only been a nightmare. But then, from the very last row, came a sound. The whisper. Low and patient. Waiting for the next passenger.
The night bus always left the depot at 11:45 sharp, rattling out of the city with its half-working lights and squealing brakes. The regulars knew its quirks, knew which seats bounced worst, which windows leaked when it rained. But on this night, one seat was different, and everyone who boarded seemed to sense it. The bus wasn't crowded, just 8 passengers. An old man carrying a bag of groceries, a nurse on her way home from a late shift, 2 teenagers whispering about music, a heavy-set woman with her shopping piled beside her, a man in a suit with his tie loose, and a boy who couldn't have been more than 19, slouching low with his headphones in. And then there was the woman. She boarded at the 3rd stop, stepping out of the mist like she had been waiting for hours. She moved slowly, her pale hands gripping the rail as she climbed inside. The driver nodded, but she gave no answer. She dropped a few coins into the slot, took the ticket without looking, and walked straight to the very back. Not the last row, but the window seat on the left side. Nobody wanted to sit near her. They didn't even talk after she boarded. The teenagers went quiet. The nurse shifted further into the aisle. The man in the suit rubbed his eyes as if too tired to notice. But still, every few minutes, each of them turned just enough to glance toward that window seat. The woman never moved. She stared straight ahead, her body stiff, her dark hair hiding half her face. The driver had been on this route for years, and he'd learned to ignore the strange ones. But the window seat had a reputation. Drivers whispered about it when they switched shifts. Stories of passengers who took it and were never seen again. He had laughed it off. Until tonight. Because this was the first time someone had sat there in months. The road stretched into the countryside. Streetlights vanished behind them. The only glow came from the dim bulbs inside the bus and the faint sweep of headlights. Trees pressed close, shadows flickering across the windows like reaching hands. At the next stop, a man in a raincoat got on. He looked around for a seat, saw the empty space beside the woman in the window seat, and hesitated. For a second, it looked like he might take it, but then he shook his head and sat across the aisle instead. That was when the boy with the headphones pulled one earbud out and whispered, "Don't sit there." The man in the raincoat frowned. Why not? The boy's voice was low, almost lost beneath the engine. Because she's already dead. The man froze. He looked back at the woman. She hadn't moved, her head tilted slightly, hair still veiling her face. Her hands were folded in her lap, too pale, too still. The man in the raincoat swallowed hard and stared at the floor. The old man with groceries muttered under his breath. Every time the seat fills, something happens.
His voice was so soft, no one knew if he was talking to himself or warning the rest of them. The driver tightened his grip on the wheel. He knew he shouldn't listen, but his mirror tilted toward the back, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw condensation on the window beside the woman. Words traced into the fog, though the bus was too warm for the glass to mist. Letters spelled out slowly, as though drawn by a finger. Let me out. The driver blinked. The words were gone. The bus roared on. The passengers sat in silence, each one too aware of the still figure at the window. The teenagers clutched each other's hands. The nurse closed her eyes, lips moving silently as if reciting a prayer. The man in the suit pressed his forehead against the seat in front of him. The boy with the headphones leaned closer to the man in the raincoat and whispered again. She rides until someone looks at her face. Then they don't get off. The man's mouth went dry. He nodded, eyes locked forward, refusing to turn. But the problem with fear is it grows heavier the longer you ignore it. The driver couldn't stop glancing in the mirror. The passengers couldn't stop stealing looks at the back. And the woman never blinked, never shifted, never breathed. The next stop was coming. The driver slowed, heart hammering. The shelter was empty, but the doors hissed open anyway. Cold air swept in. The lights flickered. When they steadied, the woman had turned her head. Not much, just enough that more of her face was visible through the curtain of hair. The passengers gasped softly, shrinking back, but no one spoke. Her pale lips had curved into the faintest smile. The boy with headphones pulled both buds out now, trembling. "She's choosing," he whispered. The bus pulled away into the darkness, engine groaning. The road narrowed, trees closing in tighter. The passengers stared straight ahead, each breath heavy, each second stretching longer. And then the woman moved again. Slowly, too slowly, her head turned fully toward the aisle. The hair slid aside. Her face was gray, hollow, her eyes dark pits where light should be. The nurse screamed. The old man dropped his bag of groceries, apples rolling under the seats. The bus lurched violently as the driver's hands slipped on the wheel, and the woman in the window seat smiled wider, leaning forward, her voice a whisper that cut through the storm. "Which of you will it be tonight?"
The scream from the nurse still echoed in the bus when the woman's voice drifted through the aisle. It was soft, almost kind, but the words carried weight, heavy enough to press against everyone's chest. "Which of you will it be tonight?" No one answered. They couldn't. Their throats closed up, their bodies frozen. The bus kept roaring forward, the driver's knuckles white on the wheel, sweat stinging his eyes. The boy with the headphones whispered again, though his voice cracked.
Don't look at her. Don't meet her eyes. That's how she takes you. But the nurse couldn't help herself. She had already screamed, already drawn the attention. Her body trembled as she pressed back into her seat. She tried to look away, but her eyes darted back like they were caught on hooks. The woman in the window seat leaned closer, her dark gaze fixed on her. The nurse's lips trembled. "Please," she begged, voice breaking. "I don't want to die." The woman's smile widened, her pale hand lifted, pressing against the glass. A streak of condensation bloomed under her fingers, forming words again. "Your stop." The bus jolted as if it had hit a pothole. The driver tried to steady it, shouting, "No one leaves this bus. Stay in your seats." But the bus slowed on its own, brakes hissing. The stop appeared from nowhere, a shelter the driver had never seen before, rising from the fog like it had been waiting all along. The doors opened. The nurse screamed again, clawing at her seatbelt, fighting to stay down. But her body betrayed her. She rose, sobbing, her hands reaching forward like strings were pulling them. Step by step, she walked down the aisle, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent plea. "Help me," she whispered. No one moved. No one dared. The driver tried, his hand reaching for the emergency brake, but his body was locked stiff. The whisper filled him now, the same whisper that had haunted him since the first time he drove this route. The nurse reached the doors. She tried to stop. She dug her nails into the metal frame until blood streaked down her hands. But the bus hissed impatiently, urging her down the steps, and then she was gone. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. Silence fell, broken only by the storm. The passengers stared straight ahead, their faces gray, their eyes wide. The old man muttered to himself, "One every ride, one every ride," like a prayer he had repeated too many times. The driver's heart pounded, his chest felt hollow. He wanted to scream, but the whisper was still there, coiling around his mind, soothing him like a lullaby. When he dared look in the mirror, the woman in the window seat was smiling wider. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone else sat beside her. The nurse. Her body stiff, her face pale, her eyes glassy. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, head tilted just like the woman's. The teenagers began to cry softly, clutching each other. The man in the suit muttered, "Not me, not me, not me," rocking back and forth. The man in the raincoat shut his eyes tight, whispering a prayer into his clenched fists. The boy with the headphones looked at them all, his face twisted with fear. "She keeps them. That's why the seat is cursed. Once she takes you, you never leave." The driver shook his head violently. No, no more stops. I won't let her. He pressed his foot hard against the accelerator, the engine growling louder as the bus sped down the narrow road. The trees whipped past, rain hammering the windshield. But the speed didn't matter. The whisper grew louder, surrounding them, filling every space in their skulls. The woman's head turned slowly, her black eyes sweeping over each passenger. The man in the suit broke first. He screamed, his voice cracking, and stumbled to his feet. "Take someone else. I don't want to die." He staggered down the aisle, desperate to throw himself at the doors. The bus lights flickered. The doors opened without the driver touching the switch. And then he was gone. The doors closed again. When the lights steadied, he too was in the back, sitting on the other side of the woman, pale, stiff, glassy-eyed. Another permanent passenger of the window seat. The bus smelled of rot now. The air grew colder, every breath fogging. The passengers whimpered in silence. The old man with groceries muttered, "It'll be all of us, one by one, until the bus is full." The boy with the headphones shook his head violently. "No, there's one way. She leaves if someone takes her place." His voice cracked. "That's how it works. Someone has to sit in the window seat willingly." Everyone froze. The teenagers clung tighter, whispering, "No, no, no." The man in the raincoat looked sick, sweat pouring down his face. The driver's eyes burned with tears. He whispered, "I can't let it keep happening. I can't drive this road forever, carrying her. I'll do it." He slowed the bus. His body trembled as he rose, leaving the wheel. The bus moved on its own now, steering perfectly through the storm. He walked down the aisle, past the staring passengers, toward the back. The woman's smile widened. She lifted her pale hand, patting the empty space beside her. The seat everyone feared. The driver reached it. He stood shaking, his breath shallow. Slowly, he lowered himself down. The cold was immediate, piercing, like needles in his lungs. His vision blurred, his heart stuttering. The woman leaned close, whispering words no one else could hear. And then, she was gone. So was the nurse. So was the man in the suit. The window seat was empty again. The driver gasped, clutching his chest. He was alive. But when he looked at his reflection in the window, his skin was gray, his eyes darker than before. Something inside him had shifted. The bus rolled on until dawn. It reached the depot, and the remaining passengers stumbled off, pale and silent. None of them looked back. The driver didn't follow. He sat in the window seat, staring through the glass, a faint smile curving his lips. By the time the next night came, the bus was ready again. The lights flickered, the engine growled, the route waited. And in the window seat at the back, a figure sat perfectly still, watching, waiting for the next passenger to board.
The bus smelled of damp wool and cigarette smoke when it pulled out of the depot that night. It was nearly empty, the way it usually was on the long rural runs. The driver had done the route for years and had grown used to the rhythm. A handful of passengers at the city stops, Another few stragglers at the outskirts, then nothing but miles of trees and fields until dawn. But tonight felt wrong the moment he closed the doors. The air was heavy, colder than it should have been. The heater rattled but gave no warmth. The fluorescent lights buzzed, flickering like they were struggling against something unseen. The driver muttered to himself, tried to shake it off, and checked the mirror. Only 3 passengers had boarded. A girl with dyed red hair and headphones too loud to be safe. A middle-aged man in work clothes who looked like he had spent the whole day hauling something heavy. And a thin, quiet man in a gray coat who had slipped into the very back row and lay down across the seats like he meant to sleep the entire ride. The driver thought nothing of it at first. People slept on the night bus all the time. But as he rolled onto the highway, he realized the man's chest wasn't rising, not once. The red-haired girl was mouthing the words to her music, oblivious. The worker sat near the middle, rubbing his tired hands together. Neither seemed to notice the still figure at the back. The driver adjusted his mirror, squinting. The man's face was turned toward the window, pale against the glass. His hands were folded neatly on his stomach. His eyes were closed. His lips were slightly parted. Too still. The driver turned up the radio to break the silence, but static poured through the speakers. He tried another station. More static. He shut it off, unsettled. The miles rolled by. At the next stop, a young woman got on, dripping wet from the rain. She paid quickly, glanced at the rows of seats, then froze. Her eyes locked on the man in the back. She didn't say anything, but her skin went white as paper. She sat near the front, staring at her lap, trembling like she wanted to get back off, but couldn't. The driver caught her reflection in the mirror. He lowered his voice. "You all right back there?" She shook her head without looking up. "You shouldn't let him ride." The driver frowned. "Who?" "The one in the back." The worker glanced over his shoulder. "Someone back there? Thought it was empty." The girl with red hair pulled out an earbud. "What's empty?" They all looked. The back row was bare. The driver's throat went dry. He had seen him. He was certain. The young woman whispered, "He only shows up sometimes, when the bus is moving." The worker snorted nervously. "You're seeing things." But when the bus hit a bump and the lights flickered, there he was again, the man in the gray coat, lying still across the back seats, eyes shut, chest unmoving. The worker swore under his breath. The red-haired girl yanked out both earbuds, staring wide-eyed. The bus rattled deeper into the countryside. The driver's heart pounded harder with every mile. He didn't want to glance at the mirror, but his eyes kept drifting. Sometimes the back row was empty. Sometimes the sleeper was there, motionless, pale, lips parted like he was whispering something no one could hear. The young woman finally spoke again, voice trembling. "He used to be a passenger, years ago. He fell asleep and never woke up. They didn't find him until morning, still lying in the back row. Now he rides every few weeks, looking for someone to keep him company." The worker scoffed, but his voice shook. "That's just a story." The red-haired girl whispered, "Then why can we all see him?" Silence fell. Only the growl of the engine
and the drum of rain filled the air. The bus slowed for another stop. The shelter was empty, the road beyond dark. The doors opened anyway. A blast of cold night air swept through, and when they closed again, the lights flickered. This time, the man in the gray coat was sitting upright. His head was tilted forward like he had just woken. His eyes were still closed, but his lips moved, mouthing words no one could hear. The driver gripped the wheel tighter, sweat beading on his forehead. The young woman buried her face in her hands. The worker cursed again, staring at the back in disbelief. The red-haired girl whispered, "What's he saying?" Silence fell. Only the growl of the engine and the drum of rain filled the air. The bus slowed for another stop. The shelter was empty, the road beyond dark. The doors opened anyway. A blast of cold night air swept through, and when they closed again, the lights flickered. This time, the man in the gray coat was sitting upright. His head was tilted forward like he had just woken. His eyes were still closed, but his lips moved, mouthing words no one could hear. The driver gripped the wheel tighter, sweat beading on his forehead. The young woman buried her face in her hands. The worker cursed again, staring at the back in disbelief. The red-haired girl whispered, "What's he saying?" The driver swallowed hard. "I don't know." But then, faintly, they all heard it. A whisper, threading through the bus, soft and cold. "I'm so tired." The man in the gray coat lifted his head. His eyes opened. They were clouded white, empty. And he smiled.
The bus went silent the moment his eyes opened. Even the engine seemed muted, the rain dulling, as if the world outside had drawn away. The sleeper sat upright now, gray coat hanging loose, white eyes fixed on the aisle. His lips moved again, voice drifting like wind through an empty house. "I'm so tired. Come lie with me." The red-haired girl pressed her back into the seat, clutching her headphones like they could shield her. The worker muttered curses under his breath, too scared to look away. The young woman in the front shook violently, covering her ears, but the whisper still seeped in, curling into every skull. The driver fought the urge to slam the brakes. His instincts screamed to throw open the doors and run, but his hands wouldn't obey. His body felt heavy, like he'd been awake for days. The sleeper rose from the back row. His movements were slow, dragging, as though gravity pulled harder on him than anyone else. He stepped into the aisle, head bowed, lips still moving. "I'm so tired. Come lie with me." Each step echoed louder than it should, hollow thuds on the bus floor. The air grew colder. Frost began to creep across the windows. The lights above buzzed, flickered, dimmed. The worker finally snapped. He stood, pointing a trembling finger. "Stay away from me! You hear me? Stay the hell away!" The sleeper stopped. Slowly, his head lifted. His white eyes locked on the worker.
His smile widened, cracked lips stretching too far. The worker stumbled back into his seat. "No, no, please." The sleeper whispered, louder now. "You're tired. Come lie with me." The bus jerked violently, as if something had grabbed it. The driver swore, wrestling with the wheel, but the road blurred under his hands. For a moment, it felt like the bus wasn't touching the ground at all, like it was gliding through nothing. The worker screamed. His body stiffened, jerked, then slowly rose from his seat against his will. His eyes rolled back, his mouth open in a silent wail. The sleeper raised a pale hand, and the worker floated down the aisle, feet dragging uselessly against the floor. The others screamed. The young woman clawed at her seatbelt. The red-haired girl sobbed into her hands. The driver shouted, "Stop it! Leave him alone!" But the sleeper only turned, leading the worker back to the rear row. They both sat. The sleeper lay down again, curling across the seats like before. The worker collapsed beside him, limp, eyes dull, chest unmoving. The whisper stopped. The bus slammed back into reality, tires screeching against the wet road. The driver nearly lost control, but forced it straight. His chest heaved with breath, sweat dripping into his eyes. When he looked in the mirror, two bodies lay across the back row now, both perfectly still, both pale, both smiling faintly. The passengers were sobbing openly. The young woman rocked herself, whispering, "It's not real, it's not real." The red-haired girl pressed her face to the window. But the bus did not stop. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the trees crowding closer. At the next stop, the shelter was empty again, but the doors opened on their own. Cold air swept through. The driver tried to shut them, but the switch did nothing. The young woman gasped, clutching her seat. "He wants another." The red-haired girl shook her head violently. "No, no, I'm not going back there." The young woman's eyes brimmed with tears. "He takes them one by one until he's not lonely anymore." The driver shouted, "Stay in your seats!" But the whisper was rising again, filling every inch of the bus. "I'm so tired. Come lie with me." The red-haired girl screamed. She ripped her headphones in half, trying to shut it out, but it was inside her skull. She clutched her head, kicking, thrashing, and then she went still. Her eyes glazed over, white and empty. Slowly, she rose. The driver swore and tried to grab her, but she walked past him like he wasn't there, her steps slow, dreamlike. She shuffled down the aisle, joining the sleeper at the back. When the lights flickered again, 3 bodies lay across the seats. The driver sobbed. He had lost 3 passengers in less than an hour. The young woman was the only one left, her eyes wide, her face drenched with tears. She turned toward him. "Please, please, you have to end the route. You have to stop the bus." But the driver couldn't. His foot pressed the pedal, his hands clamped the wheel, but the bus moved as though driven by someone else. The road kept winding, the stops kept appearing out of the fog. The whisper rose again. "I'm so tired. Come lie with me." The young woman screamed, clawing at her windows. She threw herself into the aisle, kicking, fighting, but invisible hands pulled her back. She was dragged down the row, screaming until her voice broke. She joined the others in silence. 4 lay at the back now. The driver shook violently. He could barely see through his tears. His body wanted to stop, but the whisper filled him too. His head nodded, his eyes drooped. He felt so heavy, so unbearably heavy. His hands left the wheel. The bus didn't swerve. It carried on perfectly through the fog, deeper into nowhere. The driver rose, trembling. His legs felt like lead. Slowly, step by step, he walked down the aisle. His mind screamed at him to turn back, but his body betrayed him. The whisper caressed him, soft, soothing. "You're so tired. Come lie with me." He reached the back row. The sleeper's pale hand reached out, waiting. 4 still bodies lay across the seats, eyes dull, mouths smiling faintly. The driver's breath caught, his heart stumbled. He lowered himself down. The cold swallowed him whole. His eyes went white, his lips stretched into a smile. He lay still beside the others. The bus continued through the night, empty now. Empty but for the sleeper and those who had joined him. By dawn, it would reach the depot again. The doors would open. New passengers would climb aboard, unaware. And in the back row, the sleeper would be waiting.
The rain was steady but light when the night bus rolled out of the city. It wasn't the storm that made the passengers uneasy. It was the route itself. Everyone who rode often enough knew there was something strange about the stretch between the industrial park and the old quarry. Drivers said the bus always felt heavier there, like it carried more weight than the bodies inside it. The driver that night was named Collins. He had run the route for nearly 15 years and had learned never to question the road too much. Just keep the bus moving, keep the schedule, don't look too hard in the mirror. There were 6 passengers, a young couple whispering to each other near the front, a delivery worker with mud still on his boots, a woman in her 50s clutching 2 shopping bags, a man with a laptop case and tired eyes, and at the very back, alone, a teenager with a hood pulled low over his face. The bus rattled through the industrial park and into the dark stretch of highway. The passengers sank into their silence, lulled by the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the wipers. Collins kept his eyes on the road, but he couldn't help noticing the teenager in the mirror. The boy never moved. He just sat with his head lowered, hands clasped together, like he was waiting for something. The bus slowed for the stop outside the quarry road. The shelter stood crooked, its light broken, weeds pressing through the cracks of the pavement. Normally, there was nobody here. Tonight, a man was waiting. Collins frowned as he saw him. The figure was tall, too tall, his shoulders hunched unnaturally. His clothes were soaked, though the rain had barely touched the road. He didn't wave. He just stood still, staring as the bus pulled up. The doors opened with a hiss. The man climbed aboard slowly. His head scraped the ceiling. His face was pale, long, with features too sharp to sit right. Collins waited for coins, for a pass, but the man walked straight past him without a word. "Hey," Collins called, uneasy. "You gotta pay." The man turned his head slightly, enough for Collins to glimpse his eyes. They were black,
Not dark, but black, like ink, swallowing the light. Colin's mouth went dry. He said nothing else as the man made his way to the back. The teenager in the hood shifted for the first time, sliding against the window to make room. The pale man sat beside him. The other passengers noticed too. The woman with shopping bags pressed her lips tight. The couple whispered more urgently. The delivery worker glanced nervously at the floor. Collins pulled the bus back onto the road. His hands were slick on the wheel. The engine sounded wrong, like it was laboring under a greater weight. The lights flickered once, and when they steadied, Collins blinked in confusion. The next stop was gone. It should have been a crossroads with a petrol station, but instead, the road stretched into black forest. No sign of buildings, no sign of light. He muttered under his breath, "What the hell?" The passengers noticed too. The man with the laptop looked up from his phone, frowning. "Did you skip the stop?" Collins shook his head. "I didn't." The delivery worker peered out the window. "I ride this bus every week. That station's always there." The couple exchanged worried looks. The woman with shopping bags clutched them tighter. Only the teenager and the pale man at the back remained still. Neither spoke, neither blinked. Colin's stomach turned. He checked the clock above the windshield. The hands spun slowly backward. The woman gasped, "Driver, the time! Look at the time!" The passengers leaned forward. The clock was moving in reverse, seconds ticking back, minutes unspooling. Collins gritted his teeth. Probably just broken. But the road outside wasn't normal either. The forest pressed closer. Trees bent toward the bus like they wanted to climb inside. The headlights stretched far, too far, but revealed no turns, no buildings, no end. Collins glanced at the mirror again. The pale man had turned his head. He was whispering into the teenager's ear. The boy nodded slowly, never lifting his hood. Collins tried to focus. Just keep driving, he told himself. He could still reach the next stop. Maybe everything would reset. But when the lights flickered again, another stop was gone. The road wound through hills Collins had never seen before. His hands shook. The passengers murmured nervously, voices rising. The man with the laptop demanded, "What's happening? Where are we?" Collins didn't answer. He couldn't. The delivery worker stood, eyes wide. "This isn't the route. We need to get off." Collins shouted, "Sit down." But the doors hissed open on their own. Cold air rushed in. The forest outside yawned black, branches stretching like arms. The delivery worker froze. He tried to move back, but his body locked. Slowly, stiffly, he turned and walked down the steps. "No!" Collins shouted, lunging for the controls. The doors shut behind the man. The bus pulled away. The woman screamed, clutching her bags. The couple held each other. The man with the laptop slammed his fists against the seat. Colin's throat was dry as he checked the mirror. The pale man smiled, and the teenager in the hood was gone.
The bus rattled onward, deeper into the black forest, and the road stretched like it had no end. Colin's hands ached on the wheel, but he didn't dare let go. His heart hammered as he stole another glance in the mirror. The teenager's seat was empty. Only the pale man remained at the back, too tall for the seat,
shoulders hunched, black eyes fixed on the front. His smile stretched thin across his face. Collins forced himself to look away, focusing on the endless road. The passengers weren't calm anymore. Panic spread through them like fire. The woman with the shopping bags sobbed openly. "He's gone! The boy's gone! Where did he go?" The man with the laptop shouted, "Driver, turn this bus around! You hear me? We're not on the route anymore!" Collins shouted back, voice cracking, "Do you think I don't know that?" The couple clung to each other, whispering frantic prayers. The lights flickered again. The air grew colder. Frost laced the windows from the outside. When the bus jolted, Collins realized the road had changed again. This wasn't asphalt anymore. The sound was wrong. A hollow, echoing thud rose beneath them, like the bus was driving across an endless bridge. But when Collins looked out the window, there was no bridge, just a black abyss swallowing everything beneath. He gripped the wheel tighter, sweat stinging his eyes. "Just keep driving," he whispered. The pale man rose from the back row. His head brushed the ceiling as he straightened. The other passengers shrank back in fear. The couple whimpered. The woman with bags pressed herself against the glass. The man with the laptop froze, staring. The pale man moved slowly, each step deliberate, his long fingers trailing along the seats as he walked down the aisle. His eyes never left Collins. "Stay back," Collins shouted, voice shaking. "Stay away from me!" The man stopped in the aisle, tilting his head slightly, as though amused. His voice was low and sharp, cutting through the hum of the engine. "This bus does not belong to you anymore." Collins felt a tremor run through him. His body stiffened against the wheel, his foot heavy on the pedal, though he wasn't pressing it. The bus kept moving on its own, carrying them across the endless black. The pale man turned slowly, fixing his gaze on the passengers. His smile widened. The man with the laptop stood, fists clenched. "I don't know what kind of sick game this is, but I'm not part of it." He charged forward, trying to shove past. The pale man's hand shot out, impossibly fast, wrapping around the man's throat. The laptop clattered to the floor as the passenger kicked and clawed, but the pale man only lifted him higher, feet dangling above the aisle. The woman screamed. The couple clutched each other tighter. Collins' voice cracked, "Stop it!" But the pale man's eyes never left Collins as he whispered, "Every route has its toll." The man with the laptop went still. His body slackened, his face drained of color, his eyes rolling back white. The pale man released him, and he collapsed in the aisle with a dull thud. The woman with shopping bags dropped to her knees, praying under her breath. The couple cried openly now, unable to move. The pale man turned again and began walking forward, toward the driver's seat. Collins tried to stand, tried to fight, but his body locked against the wheel. His voice shook. "What do you want?" The pale man leaned close, his face inches away, breath cold as winter. "I want you to drive. I want you to carry them." "Carry who?" Collins rasped. The man tilted his head toward the back. Collins dared a glance in the mirror and froze. The teenager was back. He sat in his seat, hood still pulled low, hands clasped just as before. Next to him sat the man with the laptop, pale, eyes empty, breathing shallow. Collins' stomach dropped. The bus wasn't emptying, it was filling. The pale man whispered, "Every night, more are waiting, and you will never skip them again." The bus shuddered violently. The couple screamed as their seatbelts tightened around them, locking them in place. The woman with shopping bags dropped to her knees, praying under her breath. The doors did. The doors hissed wide, blackness yawning outside. The woman froze mid-crawl, and then, without a word, without a scream, she slid out the door, as though pulled by unseen hands. Her voice was gone. The doors shut. The pale man straightened, towering. His black eyes gleamed. He turned toward the couple, who were sobbing into each other's shoulders. "No," Collins whispered. "Leave them." The pale man ignored him. He reached out with both hands, and the couple's cries stopped instantly. Their heads tilted back, eyes blank, mouths slack. The seatbelts unlocked, and their bodies rose weightlessly, floating down the aisle to the back. Collins' chest heaved as he watched them settle beside the teenager, beside the laptop man, beside the pale bodies already gathered. The bus was filling, row by row. Collins finally snapped. He tore his hands from the wheel, stood, and shoved at the pale man with all the strength left in his body. For the first time, the pale man stumbled. The bus lurched violently. The abyss outside the windows rippled, swallowing light. Collins threw himself at the controls, pulling the brake, slamming every switch, screaming, "Let me off this bus!" The pale man's voice boomed, louder than thunder. "There is no off." The lights exploded, glass shattering across the aisle. Darkness swallowed the interior. The only glow came from the pale man's black eyes. Collins felt his breath leave him. His knees buckled. The last thing he saw in the mirror was himself, sitting at the back row, eyes pale, body still. The bus rolled on through the void, driverless now. By dawn, it would return to the depot, just as it always did. The doors would open. New passengers would step aboard, tired and unsuspecting. They would never notice the faces pressed against the back windows, pale and waiting. And they would never realize the bus had already skipped their stop.
The night bus left the terminal at 11:30. It was one of the older buses, the kind that rattled even when the road was smooth, the kind that smelled faintly of damp fabric and old diesel. Most nights, the bus carried only a handful of passengers, but tonight there were just 3 of them
besides the driver. The driver's name was Hensley. He had been working this route for nearly 20 years, and he always told himself the late shift was easy. Fewer passengers, less noise, no traffic. Just dark roads and quiet streets until morning. But sometimes, when he drove too long without speaking to anyone, the silence of the empty bus pressed too hard against him. The first passenger was a nurse in blue scrubs. She sat near the middle of the bus, scrolling slowly through her phone, her tired eyes half closed. The second was a man in a gray suit who looked as though he hadn't slept in days. He sat near the front, head leaning against the window, occasionally muttering to himself. The third was a girl in her early 20s, wearing headphones and staring blankly out the window, mouthing the words to a song only she could hear. Hensley kept his focus on the road. The route was familiar, from the city to the suburbs, past the rail yard, past the factories, out toward the smaller towns. There were usually 7 stops between the terminal and the end of the line. But tonight, something was wrong. It started small. At the first stop after the terminal, the shelter was empty. That wasn't unusual at this hour. But when Hensley checked the schedule clock above the windshield, he frowned. The time didn't match. It was already showing 12:30, though he had only just left. He shook it off. The clock was old. The nurse yawned. The man in the suit rubbed his eyes. The girl turned up her music. Nothing strange, nothing out of place. The second stop came and went. No passengers waiting. The third, the same. By the fourth stop, Hensley was drumming his fingers nervously against the wheel. He had never gone this far without picking someone up. Then, at the fifth stop, there was someone. A man stood under the broken light of the shelter. He wore a black coat buttoned to the collar and a hat pulled low over his face. His hands were hidden in his pockets. He didn't step forward when the bus approached, didn't wave to signal, didn't move at all. Hensley hesitated. He told himself he had no reason not to open the doors. A passenger was a passenger. The man climbed aboard slowly. His steps were deliberate, heavy against the bus floor. When he looked up at Hensley, his face was shadowed by the hat. The driver could see only the curve of a pale jaw, the glint of eyes that never seemed to blink. "Fair," Hensley said automatically, though his voice caught slightly. The man's lips curled into something like a smile. He spoke in a low voice that carried too clearly in the empty bus. "I'll pay when we arrive." Hensley wanted to protest, but the man moved past him, walking down the aisle with long strides. None of the 3 passengers seemed to notice him. The nurse kept scrolling her phone. The man in the suit muttered to himself. The girl bobbed her head to her headphones. The man in the black coat took the very last seat at the back. He sat perfectly straight, his hat tilted forward, his pale hands folded neatly on his lap. Hensley's skin crawled. He gripped the wheel tighter and pulled the bus back onto the road. For several miles, nothing happened. The rain began to fall, light at first, then harder, streaking the windows. The wipers groaned across the glass. But when Hensley glanced at the mirror, his stomach dropped. There were now 4 passengers besides the man in the black coat. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, sat 2 seats in front of the stranger. His clothes were outdated, scuffed shoes, a shirt buttoned wrong. His face was pale, his expression blank. Hensley blinked hard. He hadn't stopped again. No one had boarded. The boy stared straight ahead, hands resting on his knees. Hensley cleared his throat and spoke over the microphone. Next stop, 10 minutes. His voice was too loud in the silence. None of the passengers reacted. Not the nurse, not the man in the suit, not even the boy who shouldn't have been there. The bus rumbled on. The rain fell harder. The road grew darker. Hensley checked the clock again. It read 2:15. Impossible. He had only been driving 40 minutes at most. His throat tightened. He looked again at the mirror. Now there were 5 passengers at the back. Another figure had appeared, sitting beside the boy. A woman in a long dress, her face turned away, her hair hanging limp over her shoulders. She sat rigid, unmoving, as though she had been waiting for years. Hensley's hands trembled on the wheel. His voice cracked when he spoke. "What is this?" The man in the black coat tilted his head. For the first time, Hensley saw his eyes clearly. They were black, bottomless, and they locked on him through the mirror. The bus shook violently, rattling the windows. The nurse screamed. The man in the suit jumped to his feet, shouting. The girl ripped off her headphones, looking around in confusion. And at the back, the man in the coat finally smiled. The bus lights flickered. When they steadied, the boy and the woman were gone. Only the man in the black coat remained. But Hensley knew now that he was not the last passenger.
The bus was too quiet after the flicker of the lights. The sound of the engine seemed muted, as though the road had pulled them into some place apart from the rest of the world. Hensley gripped the wheel hard that his knuckles shone white. His throat was dry, his voice too low when he tried to steady himself. "Just a long night, just the rain," he whispered. But he knew better. The 3 passengers he had started with, the nurse, the man in the suit, the girl with headphones, were no longer restless. They sat too still now, their heads tilted slightly, as though straining to hear something faint in the distance. None of them looked toward the back of the bus. None of them seemed to see the man in the black coat. Only Hensley saw him, and the man was smiling. The rain beat harder against the glass. Water streaked down the windows in silver sheets, and the road looked darker than it should, as if the headlights could not break more than a few yards ahead. The bus groaned as it turned. Hensley frowned. The route should have stayed straight until the next stop, but the wheel tugged under his hands, as though guiding itself. The road bent sharply, leading them somewhere he didn't recognize. He glanced at the mirror again, just for a second. There were more passengers. Not 3, not 4, a half dozen now, maybe more. Pale shapes sitting in the rows behind them, their clothes worn, their eyes sunken. They sat perfectly straight, silent, not breathing.
The man in the coat sat among them, towering, his face too pale, his grin unbroken. Hensley's chest tightened. He pressed harder on the gas, then eased back, but the bus held its own speed. He wasn't controlling it anymore. The man in the suit finally snapped. He stood and shouted, his voice shaking with desperation. "Driver, where are we going? This isn't the route. You passed my stop miles back. Stop the bus." Hensley's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The man stumbled down the aisle, grabbing seatbacks for balance, glaring at Hensley. "Are you deaf? Stop this bus." Hensley wanted to tell him to sit down, to stay put, but before he could, the suit man froze. His eyes went wide, staring past Hensley's shoulder, toward the mirror. Hensley turned his head. The passengers at the back had leaned forward, not just one or two, but all of them at once, moving in a single silent rhythm. Their faces were gray and hollow, their mouths slightly open, as though they were breathing him in. The man in the coat sat among them, towering, his face too pale, his grin unbroken. Hensley's chest tightened. He pressed harder on the gas, then eased back, but the bus held its own speed. He wasn't controlling it anymore. The man in the suit finally snapped. He stood and shouted, his voice shaking with desperation. "Driver, where are we going? This isn't the route. You passed my stop miles back. Stop the bus." Hensley's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The man stumbled down the aisle, grabbing seatbacks for balance, glaring at Hensley. "Are you deaf? Stop this bus." Hensley wanted to tell him to sit down, to stay put, but before he could, the suit man froze. His eyes went wide, staring past Hensley's shoulder, toward the mirror. Hensley turned his head. The passengers at the back had leaned forward, not just one or two, but all of them at once, moving in a single silent rhythm. Their faces were gray and hollow, their mouths slightly open, as though they were breathing him in. The man in the suit screamed. He stumbled backward, tripping into an empty seat, clawing at the window as though he could tear it open. The glass fogged instantly behind his hands. The girl with the headphones pulled them off and dropped them on the floor, her voice trembling. "What's happening? Why won't it stop?" The nurse clutched her phone against her chest. The screen flickered, cycling through numbers and symbols too fast to read, then went dark. She whispered, "Oh God, please." And then the bus slowed on its own. The hiss of the brakes cut through the chaos. The headlights illuminated a stop that shouldn't exist, a shelter that looked old and rotted, its roof sagging, its sign unreadable. A figure waited there. Tall, thin, draped in a wet coat, its head bowed low so that his face was hidden. The doors opened with a long hiss. The smell of rot seeped into the bus, cold and heavy, curling into every seat. The man in the suit bolted. He ran for the doors, his body shoving past the invisible weight of fear. He leapt into the darkness outside. The moment his feet touched the ground, the the doors slammed shut. Hensley's breath came sharp. He looked out the window, trying to see where the man had gone, but there was nothing there, just the sagging shelter and the dark road stretching endlessly on. The bus moved again. The girl sobbed into her hands. The nurse whispered broken prayers. And when Hensley looked back into the mirror, the man in the suit was there again, sitting 2 rows behind the nurse. His face was pale, his mouth slack, his eyes empty. One of them now. The man in the coat rose slowly, gripping the edge of his seat as he stood. He walked forward, step by step, his shoes echoing hollow against the floor. He moved past the silent pale figures, past the girl, past the nurse. He stopped just behind Hensley, one long hand resting on the rail of the driver's seat. His voice was calm, measured. You will carry them, all of them, until the road is finished. Hensley tried to protest, but his voice cracked, no sound leaving his throat. His hands still gripped the wheel, but he felt them numb, disconnected, as though they no longer belonged to him. The man leaned closer, his breath cold against Hensley's ear. You are the driver now. You will always be the driver. Hensley's vision blurred, his chest tightened. The sound of the engine deepened like a heartbeat pounding too loud. He blinked, and in the mirror, he saw himself. Not at the wheel, not sweating, not trembling, but at the back, sitting among the pale passengers, eyes dull, face empty. The man in the coat slid into the driver's seat, his hands folding over the wheel as though they had always been there. His hat tilted forward, his pale jaw sharp against the dim light. The bus hummed as it pressed forward into darkness that had no end. The nurse screamed once and went silent. The girl sobbed until her voice broke. One by one, their voices faded into the quiet, until all that remained was the sound of the engine, steady and eternal. And the bus rolled on, down a road no...
The bus smelled faintly of mildew when it pulled up to the stop on Ashgrove Road. The street lamps buzzed and flickered, fighting against the heavy fog that had settled low over the street. Only one passenger waited, a man in his late 20s with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He stepped aboard, paid his fare with exact change, and moved quickly down the aisle. He didn't notice the figure at the very back. The driver, an older woman named Carol, did. She had driven this route for years, and she could count every regular who rode after midnight. Tonight, the faces were new. There were only 3 passengers: the young man with the duffel bag who had just boarded, a woman in a long coat staring down at her folded hands, and the figure at the very back, sitting perfectly still, face hidden in the shadow of a hood. Carol watched him in the mirror. The hood was drawn low, and though the bus was warm enough, the figure did not move, not even to adjust.
He sat with his hands resting flat on his knees, as though waiting. The young man with the duffel settled into a seat halfway down. He pulled out a paperback book, but didn't open it, just held it against his leg and stared out the window. The woman in the coat shifted once and sighed softly. Carol adjusted her grip on the wheel. The fog was thick. The headlights lit only a wall of gray, and the road seemed to disappear ahead of them. She told herself the man at the back was just another rider. It wasn't unusual for someone to wear a hood, not at this hour, not on this route. Still, she checked the mirror again. He hadn't moved at all. The first stop passed with no one waiting. The second, the same. At the third, a middle-aged man in work clothes boarded, his face lined with exhaustion. He nodded politely at Carol, dropped a handful of coins into the fare box, and shuffled down the aisle. He sat near the woman in the coat, exhaling heavily. "Long night," Carol said, but her voice barely carried. He nodded again without looking at her. When she glanced back at the mirror, her heart gave a small jolt. There were now 2 figures at the back. The hooded one remained where he had been, unmoving. Beside him, a second figure had appeared. This one was smaller, thinner, maybe a child, its head lowered, its face hidden. Carol's throat tightened. She hadn't stopped long enough for another passenger to slip aboard unseen. She stared at the mirror, waiting for the small figure to move, to shift, to prove itself human. It didn't. The bus rattled on. The young man with the duffel tapped his fingers against the cover of his book. The woman in the coat twisted her hands together. The worker rubbed his temples and shut his eyes. None of them seemed to notice the extra figure. At the next stop, a pair of teenagers boarded, laughing too loudly, their voices breaking the heavy silence. Carol was almost grateful for the noise. She checked the mirror again. The hooded figure sat still. The smaller one beside it leaned slightly forward now, its head cocked at an angle too sharp to be comfortable. Carol gripped the wheel tighter. She had been driving this route long enough to know the stretches of road. After the 7th stop, there was nothing but woods on either side for nearly 6 miles. No houses, no streetlights, no signs of life until the town on the far edge. When she reached that stretch, the fog thickened. The bus lights bounced back against it, making the glass glow white. The road felt narrower than usual. The trees pressed close, though she could barely see them. The laughter of the teenagers quieted. The worker had drifted into a shallow doze. The woman in the coat pressed her lips together, her eyes fixed on her lap. The young man with the duffel finally opened his book, but seemed unable to focus, his eyes sliding from the page to the window and back again. And, from the mirror, Carol saw the small figure move. It turned its head towards the aisle, slow and deliberate. Its face remained hidden behind shadow, but its posture shifted as though it was about to rise. Carol's foot hovered near the brake. Her throat ached with the need to say something, to call back to the passengers to demand whether anyone else saw what she was seeing. But before she could speak, the hooded figure raised a hand. Just one hand, pale and thin, lifting slightly from its knee. The small figure froze. The hand lowered again. Carol forced her gaze forward, heart pounding. She kept both hands locked on the wheel, her breath shallow, the road ahead fading deeper into fog. Behind her, the passengers shifted in their seats, restless, uneasy, but silent. And at the very back, the hooded figure sat as though it had been carved from stone, watching, waiting, holding everything in place. Carol knew then that she wasn't the one in control of her bus anymore. The road stretched on, endless, and the clock above the windshield ticked forward to midnight, though she could have sworn it had already been past 1. The man with the duffel leaned forward as if about to ask a question, but stopped. His eyes drifted to the back. He frowned. His lips parted. Carol followed his gaze in the mirror. Now there were 3 figures at the back. The hooded one, the small one, and something else, taller than both, its head bent against the roof, its long arms folded across its chest. The young man's face went pale. He clutched his book tighter, as if it were a shield. Carol whispered under her breath, her voice almost lost in the growl of the engine. "Don't look at them." The fog swallowed the bus whole.
The bus rattled through the fog, its headlights glowing uselessly against the wall of gray. Carol kept her hands tight on the wheel, her shoulders stiff, her throat dry. The sound of the engine was steady, but the silence of the passengers pressed around her, heavy, unnatural, as though the air inside the bus was too thick to breathe. She wanted to turn, to look directly at the back rows, to prove to herself that what she had seen was only a trick of the mirror. But she didn't. She knew that once her eyes left the road for too long, something worse might happen. The young man with the duffel still clutched his book, though his hands shook slightly. He had seen them too. She knew it. His face was pale, his gaze flicking nervously to the rear, and then snapping forward again, never daring to rest for long. The woman in the long coat sat with her head bowed, but her shoulders were trembling, as though she was silently sobbing. The worker had stopped snoring in his shallow sleep. His face was slack, his mouth open, but his chest barely moved. The teenagers who had been laughing earlier sat pressed together now, whispering in sharp, hurried bursts, trying to act braver than they felt. Carol forced herself to breathe slow, steady. She gripped the wheel tighter and whispered under her breath, so low that only she could hear. "Just make it to the town. Just make it through." But the fog stretched endlessly. No signs, no lights, no curves in the road she recognized. Only the straight line forward, mile after mile, as if the world had folded itself into one unending stretch of asphalt. She risked one glance into the mirror. Her stomach dropped.
The 3 figures at the back were closer. They had not walked. She had not heard footsteps. But the hooded figure now sat only 3 rows from the last passenger. The smaller one was perched in the seat beside it, its head tilted unnaturally far, watching the aisle. The tall, bent thing stood half leaning against the side wall, its arms hanging low, long fingers brushing the floor. Carol's throat tightened. Her hands began to sweat on the wheel. The young man with the duffel looked straight at her reflection in the mirror. His eyes were wide, desperate. His lips moved silently, shaping words without sound. She read them clearly. "Do you see them?" Carol nodded once, quick, sharp, the smallest movement. The young man's chest rose and fell in relief, but he quickly turned away. He pulled his hood up as if hiding could make a difference. The bus creaked. The lights above flickered once. When they steadied, the worker was no longer in his seat. Carol blinked hard. She scanned the aisle, the rows. The man in work clothes, the one who had been snoring, was gone. His jacket lay crumpled on the seat where he had been, but the space beside it was empty. The woman in the coat pressed her hands harder to her lap. Her head stayed bowed, but her body shook visibly now. One of the teenagers whispered, "Where'd he go?" His voice cracked. The other hushed him sharply. Carol's chest pounded. She pressed the accelerator, trying to coax more speed out of the old bus. But the engine groaned, and the road seemed to stretch longer the faster she pushed. From the mirror, she saw the tall figure move. It straightened slightly, lifting its head. Its face was still shadowed, but she glimpsed the curve of something too wide to be human, a grin that stretched from one side of its skull to the other. The lights flickered again. When they steadied, the woman in the coat was gone too. Her folded hands, her lowered head, her trembling shoulders, all vanished. Only the impression of her weight remained in the seat, a dent in the cushion that slowly lifted itself back to shape. The teenagers whimpered now. One clutched the other's arm tightly, both of them staring forward, refusing to turn their heads. The young man with the duffel buried his face in his hands. Carol wanted to stop. She wanted to pull the bus to the shoulder, fling open the doors, and let everyone run. But she knew there was nothing outside but fog, and if they stepped into it, I wasn't sure they would ever find their way out again. The bus kept rolling. She checked the clock above the windshield. The hands spun slowly backward, ticking in reverse. Midnight, then 11, then 10. The numbers slid down until there was nothing but blank space where the face of the clock should have been. She looked at the mirror again. The hooded figure was standing now, in the aisle. The small one crawled along the seat, moving with jerks and spasms, its head twisting too far. The tall one loomed behind them both, its grin wider, its arms unfolding, reaching almost to the ceiling. Carol's breath hitched. She whispered sharply, to herself, to the wheel, to whatever might be listening. Not mine to take. The young man with the duffel suddenly leapt from his seat. He stumbled forward, gripping the poles, his eyes wild. "Stop the bus," he shouted, his voice cracking. Let me out, please." The teenagers began to cry openly now. One of them buried his face in his hands, rocking back and forth. Carol's knuckles were white on the wheel. She shook her head, her voice a broken rasp. "I can't. Don't you see? There's nowhere to go." The young man pounded the glass beside the driver, screaming, "I'll walk. I don't care. Just stop." The bus groaned. The engine sputtered. For a moment, Carol thought it would die, and maybe that would be the end, but it kept going, rolling steady, pulling them deeper into the fog. She looked once more into the mirror. The figures were gone. Every seat at the back stood empty. Her breath came fast, shallow, her chest aching from how tightly she held it. She glanced at the aisle, at the rows of seats. Nothing. Just her remaining passengers. The young man sobbed softly against the glass. The teenagers clung to each other. The bus was silent otherwise. For a few precious minutes, Carol dared to believe it had passed. That maybe the fog had lifted something off them. That maybe the danger was gone. Then, in the mirror, she saw movement. At first, only shadows. Then, slowly, one by one, the missing passengers returned. The worker in his worn jacket, the woman in her long coat. They sat where they had been before, but their faces were wrong. Pale, gray, their eyes blank, their mouths slightly open, as if whispering words too soft to hear. And behind them, filling the entire last row, the hooded figure, the small twisted child, and the tall grinning thing, all sitting together, motionless, waiting. Carol's voice broke as she whispered, "They never leave." The road stretched on. The fog did not end. The bus drove forward, forever.
The bus pulled up to the depot at midnight. The driver, an older man named Harris, rubbed at his eyes and sighed as he checked the schedule. This was his last run for the night, the graveyard stretch that carried only a handful of strays, if anyone at all. The route was long, winding through abandoned streets on the edge of the city, then across the industrial district, then out past the bridge to a cluster of old neighborhoods. It was a route that nobody seemed to want, but always needed. The air felt heavy that night, damp with the smell of rain, though the sky had not opened. The lights at the depot flickered as Harris climbed into the driver's seat. He switched the radio on, but the static made his head ache, so he shut it off again. Silence. He started the bus. The engine rumbled. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed faintly, cold and pale against the empty rows. When the doors opened at the first stop, a young man climbed aboard. His hood was pulled low, and his hands stayed buried in the pockets of his coat. He dropped coins into the fare box and took a seat at the back without a word. At the second stop, an older woman entered. She carried a paper bag clutched tight to her chest, her knuckles white with effort.
She nodded politely to Harris before sinking into a seat near the middle. The third stop was empty. Harris waited the required seconds anyway, staring at the rain-speckled glass. The streetlights above buzzed faintly, though one by one, they seemed to go out farther down the block. At the fourth stop, a man in a dark suit boarded. His tie was crooked, and his eyes were sunken like he hadn't slept in weeks. He walked with a stiff limp, dragging one leg slightly as he made his way to the very last row. He sat across from the hooded young man, folding his hands neatly in his lap. No one spoke. The only sounds were the low grind of the engine and the faint squeak of the wipers brushing against dry glass. The city fell away quickly. Buildings gave way to warehouses, then warehouses gave way to fields and long stretches of road that curved through patches of forest. The bus rattled on, its headlights swallowing the blackness. Harris checked the mirror often, out of habit. He counted them again and again. 3 passengers. The hooded young man, the woman with the paper bag, the suited man in the back. But at the curve before the bridge, Harris froze. There were 4. A woman he had not seen board sat in the very last row, pressed against the window. Her hair was long and damp, clinging to her pale face. She wore a thin white dress, far too light for the weather, and her bare feet left no mark on the floor. Harris blinked hard and looked again. She was still there. He clenched the wheel tighter, his chest tightening with unease. He had not stopped at any other place. He had not opened the doors. She was simply there, as though she had been riding all along. The older woman with the paper bag shifted uncomfortably. She turned once, glanced at the back rows, then quickly looked forward again. Her lips pressed tight, as if she had seen the pale woman too. The hooded young man kept his eyes on the floor, shoulders hunched, refusing to move. The suited man sat very still, his hands folded, but his head had turned slightly, his gaze fixed not on the driver, not on the other passengers, but directly on the pale woman beside him. The bus creaked as it rolled onto the bridge. The river below was dark, silent, carrying no reflection of the faint moonlight above. The fog was thickest here, swallowing the guardrails, making the world outside vanish completely. Harris fought the urge to glance in the mirror again, but his eyes betrayed him. The pale woman was smiling. Her lips moved soundlessly, as though speaking to the suited man beside her. He did not react, but his body seemed stiffer, straighter, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. The older woman clutched her bag tighter, whispering something under her breath, prayers maybe, or curses. Harris pressed harder on the pedal, but the bus didn't seem to move faster. The road stretched long across the fog. The suited man finally turned his head fully. His eyes met Harris's reflection in the mirror. And in that moment, Harris realized his eyes were not his own. They were hers, pale, glassy, and dripping with a slow, unnatural darkness. The pale woman smiled wider. Her lips moved soundlessly, as though speaking to the suited man beside her. He did not react, but his body seemed stiffer, straighter, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. The older woman clutched her bag tighter, whispering something under her breath, prayers maybe, or curses. Harris pressed harder on the pedal, but the bus didn't seem to move faster. The road stretched long across the fog. The suited man finally turned his head fully. His eyes met Harris's reflection in the mirror. And in that moment, Harris realized his eyes were not his own. They were hers, pale, glassy, and dripping with a slow, unnatural darkness. The pale woman smiled wider. The lights in the bus flickered once, twice, then steadied. But Harris counted again. 5 passengers now.
Harris gripped the wheel so tight his knuckles burned. His eyes flicked from the road to the mirror, back and forth, as though either view might betray him. The fog pressed against the glass so thick that the world beyond was nothing at all. It felt like the bridge was endless, stretching into a place where no road should go. The passengers sat in silence. The hooded young man had sunk low, his face buried beneath his hood, hands clenched together, like he was trying to pray but couldn't find the words. The woman with the paper bag muttered under her breath, still a whisper, like the scratch of dried leaves in the wind. Harris couldn't catch the words, but he knew they weren't for him. The suited man was rigid, unnatural. His head turned slowly now and then, as though listening, but not to Harris, not to the other passengers, only to her. The pale woman in the white dress sat with her face pressed close to the glass, her damp hair clinging to her skin. She had not moved since she first appeared, but her reflection in the glass shifted, just slightly, like a second version of her leaned closer, smiling wider, whispering deeper. Harris's stomach churned. He wanted to stop the bus, but there was nowhere to stop. He wanted to throw open the doors, but he knew what waited outside. Nothing but fog, an endless void. The passengers sat in silence. The hooded young man had sunk low, his face buried beneath his hood, hands clenched together, like he was trying to pray but couldn't find the words. The woman with the paper bag muttered under her breath, still a whisper, like the scratch of dried leaves in the wind. Harris couldn't catch the words, but he knew they weren't for him. The suited man was rigid, unnatural. His head turned slowly now and then, as though listening, but not to Harris, not to the other passengers, only to her. The pale woman in the white dress sat with her face pressed close to the glass, her damp hair clinging to her skin. She had not moved since she first appeared, but her reflection in the glass shifted, just slightly, like a second version of her leaned closer, smiling wider, whispering deeper. Harris's stomach churned. He wanted to stop the bus, but there was nowhere to stop. He wanted to throw open the doors, but he knew what waited outside. Nothing but fog, an endless void. The radio clicked suddenly. Static poured through the speakers, loud, harsh, alive. Then a voice slipped through, faint, broken,
like it had traveled 1,000 miles underwater. Don't let her off. Harris's breath caught. He snapped the radio off with a shaking hand, but the words lingered in his skull, heavy and cold. The pale woman turned her head slowly, her face toward him now. Her eyes were gray, cloudy, like glass filled with smoke. She smiled with lips too red against skin too pale. And then she stood. Her bare feet made no sound as she drifted down the aisle, her hair dragging wet streaks along the seatbacks. No one moved to stop her. The hooded young man hunched lower. The woman with the bag pressed her eyes shut. The suited man's head tracked her every step, as though bound. Harris tried to focus on the wheel, on the road, on anything but her. But the bus seemed to hum under her steps, as if the machine itself knew she was moving. She stopped halfway down the aisle, her hand resting lightly on a seat. Her voice was soft, calm, almost kind. "This bus isn't yours." Harris swallowed hard. His lips parted, dry, words caught in his throat. "It's my route," he whispered, as though the words might mean something. Her smile did not waver, not anymore. The suited man rose slowly from his seat. His movements were stiff, jerky, like a puppet pulled by strings. His head tilted toward her, his lips moving, but no sound came. She nodded once as though satisfied, and continued her walk. Harris's breath quickened. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, desperate to reach the end of the bridge, desperate for any sign of land, of streetlights, of life. The bus roared, but the fog swallowed the sound, swallowed everything. The pale woman stopped again, now only a few rows from the front. She leaned into the aisle, her hair swinging forward like ropes of seaweed, her face inches from the older woman clutching the paper bag. The woman whimpered, shaking her head, whispering louder now. But the pale woman only reached out a single hand, gentle, delicate, placing her palm against the paper bag. The bag crumpled instantly, collapsing inward like it was soaked through. The older woman gasped, clutching it tighter, but when she pulled it back to her lap, the bag was empty. Whatever she had carried, whatever she had guarded, was gone. She began to sob quietly, rocking in her seat. The pale woman straightened again, her eyes flicking to Harris. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, his vision swam, but he refused to stop. He refused to pull the bus over. The fog broke suddenly. Streetlights glowed ahead. The end of the bridge. The shape of the town appeared, faint but real. Harris's heart surged. He pressed the pedal harder, praying the engine would hold. The pale woman turned her head to the door. The bell dinged. Once, twice, 3 times. She wanted to get off. Harris's hands shook. He had heard the voice. Don't let her off. But every instinct screamed at him to stop, to open the doors, to let her go, and take the weight off his bus, off his chest, off his soul. The hooded young man lifted his face finally, his eyes wide, desperate. "Don't," he rasped. "Driver, don't let her." The suited man stood fully now, his face slack, his mouth hanging open. His voice came out in a hollow whisper. "She always rides. She always rides until the end. The pale woman pressed the bell again. Ding, ding. The bus slowed against Harris's will. His foot pressed hard on the accelerator, but the machine groaned, resisting, as though another force pulled the gears, tightened the brakes. The town loomed ahead. The stop was only a block away. The pale woman smiled at him one last time. Her lips moved, whispering something he almost heard. Something like, "You'll take me." The bus lurched. The brakes screamed. The doors hissed shut again. Fog poured inside, swallowing the front steps. The pale woman stepped down without a sound. Her bare feet touched the pavement, and the mist swallowed her completely. The doors hissed shut again. The bus rolled forward, trembling. Harris's hands shook so violently he could barely keep hold of the wheel. His eyes darted to the mirror. The suited man had collapsed back into his seat, head hanging. The hooded young man wept quietly into his sleeve. The older woman stared at her empty lap. Harris counted again. 1, 2, 3. He breathed deep, chest aching, relieved at last. She was gone. But then, the bus rounded the next corner. And in the mirror, there she was. Again. Sitting at the very back row, her hair damp, her skin pale, her eyes smiling through the glass. The last passenger.
The route was a quiet one. A midnight shuttle between the outskirts and the old highway. The bus rattled and hummed as it rolled along nearly empty streets, its headlights stretching pale against cracked asphalt. Daniel, the driver, was used to silence on these runs. Most nights, he had no more than 2 or 3 passengers, sometimes none at all. He told himself he liked the quiet. It made the night feel easier, safer. The clock on the dash read 12:37 when the first passenger boarded. A tall man with a hat pulled low and a long overcoat that hung heavy on his frame. He carried no bag, offered no words, only dropped a few coins into the fare box and walked straight to the back. Daniel's eyes caught something odd in the mirror. The man did not sit like others sat. He turned sideways in the seat, his head tilted, his gaze locked on the window as though something outside had his full attention. The glass reflected nothing but black, but still, the man stared. At the next stop, a pair of college kids got on, chattering loudly, their laughter echoing too sharp inside the hollow bus. They dropped into seats near the front, pulling out their phones, screens glowing blue against their tired faces. The man at the back did not move. His eyes did not leave the window. Daniel's shift went on, stop after stop. A woman with a sleeping child, a man in a rumpled uniform, an old couple holding hands in silence. Passengers came and went, but always Daniel felt it, eyes at the back, fixed, watching not him, but something outside. He tried not to look too often, but he couldn't help it. The man's head would sometimes tilt further, like he was leaning closer to the glass. His lips moved occasionally, forming words Daniel could not hear. At times, his breath fogged the pain, though the bus was cold inside. When they reached the long stretch of highway, the bus almost empty again, Daniel noticed something stranger. The man's reflection in the glass did not match. The figure in the seat stared outward, still and rigid, but the reflection moved slower, almost like it was lagging. And then, just for a blink, it turned toward Daniel, instead of the dark outside. Daniel looked away fast. pulse racing. The road grew emptier the farther they went. No cars passed them, no lights burned along the side. The only sound was the low rumble of the engine, the hiss of the tires, and sometimes, though Daniel wished he had imagined it, the faint scrape of fingernails dragging across glass. From the back. At 1:11 a.m., Daniel pulled up to a lonely stop by a closed diner. A single passenger waited, a woman in a heavy coat, clutching her purse, her breath visible in the cold. She climbed aboard, murmured a thank you, and found a seat in the middle. She glanced once toward the back, then quickly turned forward again, her shoulders stiff. Daniel wanted to ask if she had seen it too, but he stayed quiet, his throat tight. The highway stretched on. The lights of the diner vanished in the mirror. The dark closed in again. The woman fidgeted, staring down at her lap. The man at the window whispered, breath fogging the glass, and Daniel felt it finally. The bus was not just carrying passengers. It was being followed. He couldn't see it. Not yet. But the man at the window could. He stared. He whispered. He leaned closer every mile. The scrape grew louder, fingernails against glass. Only the man's nails were still, resting on his knees. The sound was not from inside the bus at all. It was from outside, dragging along the windows, keeping pace. The woman shifted in her seat, hugging her purse tight. Her eyes flicked to the side as though she saw movement in the dark beyond the glass. Her lips parted, a small sound catching in her throat. Daniel gripped the wheel tighter, his pulse loud in his ears. He wanted to look too. He wanted to see what the man at the window saw. But some deep part of him whispered back, "Don't." The bus rolled deeper into the night, and every reflection in the windows began to move just a little slower. Not just his, not just the man's, everyone's. The reflections lagged, eyes blinking too late, heads turning a moment after the real movement. But one reflection. One was ahead of its passenger. The man at the window. His reflection was already smiling.
Daniel's hands were damp against the wheel. He tried to keep his eyes on the road, but the mirror pulled him back again and again. The reflections of the passengers lagged, as though the glass had grown tired of keeping up with reality. A second slower, a breath behind. Faces turned late, and smiles appeared when no one smiled. Except for him, the man at the window. His reflection was ahead, grinning, always one step sooner. The scrape along the bus's side continued, steady, dragging from window to window. Sometimes it rose in pitch, like claws catching on the frame, then settling again. The woman in the coat shifted in her seat. She pressed her hands flat to her knees, knuckles white, her eyes locked to the floor. She hadn't looked up in several stops. Daniel wondered if she heard it too, if she knew. The bus hummed on. The headlights cut a narrow path through the dark. The world outside was nothing but black woods, an endless road. Daniel swallowed hard. "You all right back there?" he called, his voice cracking in the quiet. No one answered. The man at the window tilted his head, slowly, too slowly, like a puppet on an invisible string. His lips moved again, this time Daniel caught it, faint, soft, like the hush of dead air. They're outside. Daniel's stomach twisted. He gripped the wheel harder, eyes locked forward. He wouldn't look. He wouldn't. But then, the reflection in the glass turned fully toward him. The real man's head was still tilted toward the window, still staring outward, still unmoving. But his reflection smiled. Wide, teeth too white, too many, lips stretching thin. Daniel gasped, slamming his eyes back to the road. The scrape grew louder, sharper, moving along the length of the bus, a sound that wanted in. The woman in the coat whimpered, a soft, broken sound. Daniel caught her eyes in the mirror. She was staring at the glass beside her, shaking her head slowly, tears streaking down her face. Her reflection stared too. But her reflection was not shaking its head. It was turning toward her, smiling. Daniel's heart pounded so loud it filled his skull. He pressed the accelerator harder, the bus rattling, the engine groaning as it fought the incline of a long hill. The scrape followed, never falling behind. At the crest, the headlights swept across the trees, and for a heartbeat Daniel saw something. Hands. Dozens, pressed against the fog glass of the trees themselves, reaching from trunks, clawing out of bark, dragging along the edge of the highway. Fingers too long, nails sharp, skin pale as bone. Then the trees were gone. The dark swallowed them back, but the scrape along the windows kept pace. Daniel's vision blurred with panic. He had to finish the route. He had to get back to town. Just a few more miles. Just a few. The bus groaned as if disagreeing. The lights flickered once, twice, humming. The woman sobbed quietly into her hands. The man at the window rose to his feet. Daniel's throat closed. The man did not move like a man. His body unfolded stiff, slow, his head never turning from the glass. He stepped into the aisle, his hat shadowing his face, his overcoat dragging the floor. And his reflection moved first. It stood before him already, waiting, smiling. The scrape stopped. Silence fell heavy, thick, pressing against Daniel's skull. The man walked down the aisle, but Daniel swore he heard no footsteps. The woman pulled her knees to her chest, squeezing her eyes shut, rocking in her seat. She whispered, "Don't let him by. Don't let him by." Daniel couldn't move, couldn't speak. The man stopped halfway down. Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head toward Daniel. The reflection didn't turn. It leaned closer to the glass, grinning wider, pressing a hand against it like a child against an aquarium tank. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. His eyes darted to the road, back to the mirror, back to the man. And then the bus lurched. The headlights cut out. The engine died. The world collapsed into black. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. No screep, no hum, no sound at all. Then a voice, low, calm, inside the bus. "Look." The windows glowed faintly, not with streetlights, not with towns, not with anything human. They glowed with faces, pale, pressed against the glass from outside, eyes wide, lips moving in silence. Dozens, hundreds. Daniel wanted to scream, but the breath caught in his throat. The man at the window stepped closer to him. His hat tilted back just enough to show teeth that were too sharp, too many, grinning as though he'd been grinning all along. The reflection leaned through the glass, not out, in. Its face pressed forward, stretching impossibly, teeth clattering against the surface as though the pain was only water. The woman shrieked, clutching at her purse, but the sound cut short, strangled as her reflection seized her from the glass and pulled her face against it, lips meeting hers in a kiss that drowned her scream. Daniel slammed the ignition, twisted, begged the bus to start. Lights flickered, the engine coughed. The man's voice rose again. "You've already let us in." The reflections no longer lagged, they no longer led, they no longer matched at all. They moved freely now. Daniel saw himself in the glass. His reflection was smiling, hands loose, wheel abandoned, teeth bare. The bus roared back to life, lights flashing, engine screaming. Daniel pressed the pedal to the floor, desperate, blind, rushing into the dark. The scrape rose again, louder, sharper, filling his skull.